Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got a really interesting set of developments to unpack for you today, all coming from quite a lively discussion, actually, over on Lighthouse TV. That was Wednesday, May 14th.
Exactly. We've been digging into the transcript from that YouTube discussion, lots of different voices on there. And our mission really is just to pull out the core stuff. What are the key insights? What could it all mean for you? Cut through the noise.
Right, no filler. So we've basically landed on three main areas. First, we're looking at the Netherlands, specifically the growing legal headaches for companies using ZZ peers, independent contractors.
Yeah, this whole false self-employment thing, it's getting serious.
Then we'll pivot completely. We're heading to the Middle East, Donald Trump's recent trip to Saudi Arabia.
There's a huge investment deal to talk about, plus some, well, interesting shifts in his language about the region.
Definitely. And finally, back to the Netherlands, the big controversial transition of the Dutch pension system.
It's really heating up. Lots of criticism, calls for more citizen input. It's quite a situation.
Okay, so let's dive right into that first topic then.
Yeah.
The ZZP legal risks.
Yeah.
What's the core problem here?
Well, the fundamental issue is this growing risk for companies. It's not just the tax office poking around anymore. Now you've got the ZZP workers themselves actually going to court, trying to get recognized as employees after the fact.
And are they having much success? I mean, is this actually working?
Apparently, yes. Pim van Rijswijk, he is an MKB advisor who was on the Lighthouse show. He mentioned something striking. He said the courts are actually siding with the ZZPers in about half of these cases.
Half. Wow, that's significant. That must be causing some real financial strain, not to mention messing up working relationships.
Absolutely. And think about the costs involved. There was a specific example mentioned. A ZZP worker sued and got around €30,000.
30,000
Right.
for what exactly?
Well, they basically won employee rights, pension contributions, holiday pay, back pay, because the client didn't give proper notice. It shows the kind of financial hit companies could face.
So what's the legal footing for all this? Is the law clear?
That's part of the problem. The legal basis is, well, a bit shaky. Remember the wet DBA?
Vaguely, yeah. From 2016. Doesn't that sort of fizzle out?
Exactly. It was supposed to deregulate how employment relationships were assessed, but it didn't really work. And now, here we are in 2025, and they're basically reactivating it without any major changes.
Oh, great. So an ineffective law is now back in force.
Seems like it. And it's leading to all this confusion and enforcement based on false self-employment or, disguised employment. The clarity just isn't there.
And you can already see the impact, right? You mentioned things are changing on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing lots of these ZZP roles being turned into regular employee contracts, or companies are just using temp agencies instead.
Is there data on that?
There is. The transcript mentions CBS data showing a drop of 32,000 ZZP workers, particularly hitting technical jobs like construction. It's a clear trend.
So why is the government pushing this? What's the underlying reason?
Well, the thinking seems to be twofold. One, ensuring Social Security contributions get paid properly. And two, tackling what they apparently see as too many ZZPers who aren't really entrepreneurs in the true sense, more like employees without the label.
But it really feels like a pincer movement for businesses now.
How so?
Well, they were already worried about the tax authorities, right? But now they've also got the risk of the ZZP worker themselves taking legal action, saying, hey, you treated me like an employee, even if they signed an independent contract.
It's a double-edged sword, absolutely. The ZZP worker is now empowered in a way they weren't before.
And the financial hit could be massive, couldn't it? If these claims go back years for benefits.
Exactly. We're talking retroactive claims for pensions, holiday pay, potentially going back further than the tax office's usual 5-year window. For a smaller business, that could genuinely be enough to, well, bankrupt them.
Van Rijswijk painted a pretty bleak picture on the show, didn't he?
Yeah.
Calling it unsustainable.
He did. Said it could even lead to more unemployment or, just longer waiting times for services because companies are hesitant or unable to hire. It's a stark warning.
So what's the advice? How can businesses protect themselves?
His main suggestion was pretty practical. Consider setting up a private limited company, a BV.
To separate personal assets from the business liability.
Exactly. It creates a legal shield, basically. It protects your personal finances if the business faces one of these big claims. It makes sense in this kind of uncertain legal climate.
Okay. A lot to think about there for anyone involved with ZZP work in the Netherlands.
Definitely.
Right, let's shift gears now. Second topic. Donald Trump in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. The big headline number was, $600 billion? A huge agreement signed with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, announced at the Saudi-U.S. Investment Forum. A truly massive figure.
$600 billion. What does that even cover? Is it all arms deals or?
That's a good question. The source didn't break down the entire $600 billion, but deals this size usually cover a lot of ground. Think energy, infrastructure, tech, and yes, almost certainly a significant defense component too.
But beyond the money, there was talk about a shift in rhetoric, right? Trump's speech signaled something different.
It seemed that way. He appeared to be moving away from what you might call the traditional neocon approach, Western interventionism. Instead, he was emphasizing regional powers sorting things out themselves, focusing on economic ties over conflict.
So if this is a real shift, how could that change the U.S. role over there? What are the potential ripple effects for, say, global energy or international relations?
Well, if you connect the dots, it suggests maybe a U.S. pullback from being the primary mediator or enforcer in the region, prioritizing deals, encouraging self-reliance among regional powers. That could definitely shake up existing alliances and how conflicts are handled. It's a potential recalibration.
The term neocon came up quite a bit in the Lighthouse TV discussion. Tom Van Lamone from the Libertarian Party gave some background.
Yeah, he traced it back to figures like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, linking it to the push for regime change in Iraq, Afghanistan, the whole WMD narrative.
It represents a very specific and often debated foreign policy viewpoint.
And it provides, context for what Trump might be reacting against. The discussion even brought up that old controversial claim by General Wesley Clark about a supposed post-9/11 plan to basically take control of 7 Middle Eastern countries.
Right. Whether that plan was real or not, it reflects a certain era of very active U.S. intervention.
An era Trump seems keen to distance himself from, maybe. His emphasis now is clearly on deal-making, urging regional players to manage their own affairs. It's a different tune.
And this pragmatism, or perhaps transactional approach, leads to some interesting meetings, like meeting the Syrian interim president al-Shara.
Yes, someone previously linked with al-Qaeda affiliates. It definitely highlights the complex, sometimes uncomfortable realities of diplomacy. Strategic goals can lead to awkward handshakes.
It really can.
Huh.
And then there was talk about potentially lifting sanctions on Syria, encouraging U.S. investment in Syrian oil and gas.
That was mentioned. If that happens, it would be a major policy shift. It would certainly suggest a change in regional dynamics, perhaps driven by economic interests alongside the political ones.
Does this connect back to the Abraham Accords at all? He still talks about those a lot.
It seems to. The Accords were mentioned as something Trump believes he deserved a Nobel Peace Prize for. It suggests that fostering these normalization deals, even through unconventional means, remains a key part of his Middle East strategy. Building economic ties as a path to stability, maybe.
And speaking of economics, that huge deal, the $600 billion, isn't that also partly just about boosting the U.S. economy, improving the trade balance?
That's very likely a major factor, yes. Improving the trade balance, stimulating U.S. industries, that's been a consistent theme in Trump's foreign policy interactions globally.
So is it all transactional? The discussion seemed to raise that question, even drawing parallels to the conflict in Ukraine, suggesting maybe energy resources are a big driver.
It's a valid question. Economic interests, especially around oil and gas, undeniably play a role in shaping international relations in that region and beyond. How much they drive this specific approach is, well, up for debate.
But underlying all the deals and the controversial meetings, the stated goal still seems to be fostering stability.
Right.
However complex the path.
That appears to be the overarching narrative, yes. Stability through economic engagement and regional self-governance, though the methods are certainly open to interpretation and criticism.
Okay, a complex picture in the Middle East. Let's move to our final topic, back in the Netherlands, the pension system overhaul.
Right, the big transition. This is causing a lot of waves.
So break it down for us. What's the fundamental change happening?
Essentially, they're moving away from the old system, the big collective pot of money managed by the pension fund. Instead, it's shifting to individual pension pots for everyone. And the value of your pot will be directly linked to how the financial markets perform.
Individual pots linked to the market. That sounds riskier.
It introduces a significant element of uncertainty, definitely. This isn't some theoretical policy shift. It directly impacts pretty much everyone paying into or drawing a Dutch pension. Your future retirement income becomes less predictable.
And there's pushback. You mentioned growing criticism.
Oh, yeah. It's growing, and even coming from within the ruling coalition parties. Agnes Joseph, she's an NSC party member, is actively pushing for an amendment to give citizens more say. That tells you something about the level of unease.
What's one of the main sticking points?
A big one is the removal of a key right. People used to have the legal right to object if their existing pension deal was changed.
Okay.
Well, for this whole Inverin process, the transition into the new system, they've removed that right.
They just removed the right to object. Why would they do that? That feels like a major reduction in protection for individuals.
It's a very contentious point. The justification is likely about streamlining the transition, avoiding legal challenges that could bog down the whole process, but it definitely reduces individual power in this specific instance.
What do the financial experts say about the risks?
Doreen Rookmaker, a former MEP and financial expert on the show, really highlighted the dangers. She emphasized that tying individual pensions so directly to stock market ups and downs creates huge uncertainty. You could contribute diligently your whole life and still face major fluctuations near retirement.
And is the new system itself easy to understand?
Apparently not. That's another major criticism. It's described as incredibly complex. So complex that even the groups who originally agreed to it, like the labor unions and employer organizations, might not fully grasp all the details and implications.
That doesn't inspire confidence, does it? If the architects don't fully get it.
Not really. And think about the scale we're talking about, 1,500 billion currently in those collective funds.
1.5 trillion euros.
Yeah. Moving from that collective model to these individual accounts. And while you might get some investment choices through your provider, most people won't have direct control over the day-to-day investment strategy.
There were also questions about how democratically this whole thing came about, weren't there?
Yes, serious questions. Claims were made that a majority of parliamentarians weren't actually in favor, and perhaps tellingly, their own pension arrangements aren't subject to the same Inverin process.
Oh, really? That definitely looks like a double standard.
It certainly creates that perception.
Was there pressure from the EU for this? Sometimes these big reforms are linked to Brussels.
Well, the official line sometimes connects it to requirements for getting COVID recovery funds, need for reform, etc. But Doreen Rookmaker pushed back on that. She argued pretty strongly that this was a Dutch government initiative, not something forced by the EU.
Interesting. So the motivation might be purely domestic.
Or perhaps broader European integration goals, but initiated domestically. Pim van Rijswijk, the MKB advisor we mentioned earlier, he didn't hold back.
What did he say?
He basically lamented dismantling what many considered the world's best pension system and replacing it with, his words, a casino pension.
Casino pension. Ouch, that's quite a label.
It is. It reflects the deep concern about the shift towards market risk for individuals.
So if it wasn't EU pressure, what's the suspected underlying agenda? Why make such a drastic change?
One theory floated is alignment, making the Dutch system look more like others in Europe. Why? To help create a single, unified European capital market. This could stimulate the wider EU economy, potentially allowing these huge Dutch pension funds to be tapped for broader European projects or policies.
Using pension funds for other goals? That sounds risky too. Are the assets safe?
That's another major worry being voiced. The lack of strict legal separation asset segregation between the pension funds themselves and the banks managing the investments. Meaning, questions arise about what happens if a managing bank gets into trouble. Are the pension assets fully protected? The example of 2008 came up, when Dutch pension funds had to bail out ING Bank. It's cited as a worrying precedent.
So given all this controversy and risk, what's the proposed solution? Just tweak it.
Well, Agnes Josef's idea is the referendum. Give people a direct vote on it.
Let the public decide.
Exactly. Doreen Rookmaker went further. She thinks the whole new system should just be scrapped entirely. Start over.
Wow, scrap the whole thing. That shows how deep the opposition runs.
It really does. This whole pension transition is clearly a massive political fight. It's splitting the cabinet, involves huge financial stakes, huge political capital. It's far from over.
Okay, a really complex and concerning situation there.
Absolutely. So just to recap, we've covered quite a bit. We've dove into the increasingly tricky legal environment for companies using ZZP workers in the Netherlands.
Right. Then the potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy signaled by Trump's Saudi Arabia trip, focusing on deals and maybe a less interventionist stance.
And finally, this huge controversial overhaul of the Dutch pension system, moving towards individual market-linked pots.
And looking at them together, even though they seem disparate, you do see these significant shifts, don't you? in economics, politics, both at home and internationally.
You really do. And it brings up some big questions for you, the listener, to think about. How might these trends intersect? How could they affect your own financial planning, maybe your career, your view of global
Yeah,
events?
like what does this trend towards more individual risk, like with the pensions, mean compared to older ideas of collective security? Is that a good trade-off?
And how much does the drive for economic deals like the one in Saudi Arabia end up shaping foreign policy and international relationships, maybe even values?
Lots to mull over. This deep dive, as always, is really just scratching the surface.
Exactly. We hope it's given you a good overview and some things to think about.
We definitely encourage you to dig deeper into these topics yourself, look at different angles, and form your own conclusions. What other questions pop into your head?
Food for thought.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.